Hello, everybody. Welcome to our stream. My name is Josh, and I lead the developer advocacy team at IBM for open source data and AI. And with me is Ba, who is also developer advocate at IBM, and Raymond from Here Technologies. We're here today to talk to you about the starter kit for Call for Code, specifically the disaster resiliency starter kit. And what we'll do is I'll start by just giving a quick intro about what we did to generate the starter kit at Call for Code Geneva workshop, and um, and the high level goals we're trying to reach, and how we arrived at the specific starter kit. And then I'll turn it over to Raymond to talk about Here Technologies and how Here Technologies is helping us build the starter kit, and also over to Val to talk about the specific implementations of the starter kit. So yeah, let's get started. And I would like to start by first just sharing a video that gives a bit of a context on the starter kit, and then I will go into the presentation.
Well, there's a lot of factors that aggravate risk, and one of them, probably one of the main ones, is climate change. Climate change can provoke more severe weather. It can also cause a new kind of conditions in countries and places where, for instance, farmers are not used to those new conditions. But in other places, you have maybe worse droughts, and that has obvious effects and impacts. You can have more severe floods, and we do think, of course, it's a serious issue, and one of the most used examples is, of course, increase in sea levels. So it's obvious that coastal areas will suffer from that. I think there is a clear trend between climate change and what we're seeing as regards as the increase of risk in many of the places of the world.
So climate action and climate change, of course, has an impact on people's lives and also a vast array of human rights. And this includes the right to food, the right to water, right to housing, and even the right to life itself. And we know that those that are most affected by the impacts of climate change are often those that are already vulnerable, living in poverty. All persons also have a right to technology and science. And in order to effectively realize that right, it's important to ensure that technology is accessible also for those in vulnerable situations.
It's important to talk to domain specialists in the area where you're trying to serve, or the solution space that you're trying to address, because a lot of these have extremely specialized existing bodies of knowledge, for one, that can probably help you either not make mistakes that have already been solved, or connect you to resources that are considered to be sort of the touchstone resources for understanding this area. But even maybe more practically, it lends a lot of credibility to the product that you're proposing, or the solution that you're proposing, when it's clear that a domain specialist has already been involved, has already been consulting on the details.
In terms of particular solutions, ensuring and empowering communities, peoples, and persons, and realizing their access to information, participation, and justice in environmental matters would be hugely important.
Okay, so that hopefully gave you a bit of a context on what we're trying to do and how we're tying um, natural disasters to Call for Code. Just to kind of reiterate one or 2 points, I think Amanda mentioned, right, the reason why Human Rights Office cares about climate change is, and specifically natural disasters, is that it directly affects many of the fundamental human rights that we deem important: the right to life, the right to food and shelter, and the right to access to technology. And the other point uh, we really want to focus on was also what Adam said, which was, to build one of these solutions, it's really important to get uh, feedback from experts. Right, as we're building this technology, it's important to keep in mind that we can't build this in a vacuum. We're getting feedback from in-field experts. There's a lot of specialized knowledge there of what's been done and what needs to be done, and how you can implement a solution that's successful, can actually make an impact. So those were some of the high level things we had to keep in mind. the team there was a pretty diverse group of people from different companies, uh, including two other IBMers, Steve and Daniel Crook, and also Scott from Unity and Johnson and Jochen from Johnson and Johnson. And our focus is specifically on disaster resiliency. Uh, and uh, and the challenge statement on the highest level is that uh, climate change brings about a lot of you know, natural disasters, including drought and flood. And we wanted to identify technology solutions to address uh, one or more of these targets. And at this point, I want to bring your attention to something very specific called the Sendai framework. This is a framework created by the UN. That's a very high level framework that kind of that sets the context for what the challenge would be and how you will tackle it at a fairly high level, but also gives a lot of very good best practices on how you would tackle disaster resiliency as a problem. So before diving into this, I would highly recommend you go check out the Sendai framework and look through it to see what pieces you'll find helpful. So few of the highest level goals around disaster resiliency from Sendai framework includes reduce global disaster mortality, reduce direct disaster economic loss in relation to GDP, reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, and also increase the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk. So after talking about some of these high-level goals with a new expert, Adam, who was in the video that you saw earlier, we decided that we want to focus uh, on specifically addressing floods as a disaster that we want to target. And a few reasons. First of all, when it comes to technology, I think um, the fourth one seemed the most obvious, the early warning detection system. But Adam really pointed out that that area specifically it's just a very saturated area. There has been countless technology uh, created to address early warning flood systems, and and if you're looking to make the most impact, that is probably not the best area to focus on. So we decided to go elsewhere instead of an early prevention system. So where we decided to go was to build something that can help people navigate uh, 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 disaster like flood before, in terms of how to prepare for it, and navigate the disaster during, and also how to help um, potential victims recover from the flood afterwards. And we chose flood because due to climate change, floods is becoming uh, more and more frequent and more severe, and really affecting the communities that are in potential floodplains, um, and really causing a lot of specific issues. And and we also decided to go with flood because it's simply just the most deadly natural disaster along with droughts. So what we're doing with this solution starter kit is we want to reduce the mortality rate by helping potential victims better prepare for a flood, and how to act during a flood, and how to recover post flood. And we want to do this using a mobile application that helps users share knowledge and best practice on how to prepare, and then also facilitate communities to organize themselves throughout the whole event. And this app and will be able to reduce mortality rates and mitigate the economic damage and recover faster and help the communities recover after a flood. So so we kind of brought it down from the highest level goals from the Sendai framework down to something that's a bit more manageable, which is we want to tackle specifically floods, and also we want to help communities prepare and organize during a flood, during this natural disaster. And to take it down a further level, we decided to use IBM's design thinking, and like any product you build, you should always keep the end user in mind. So for us, right, we had to build a persona through an empathy map, and for us, throughout the workshop, we came up with a persona that is someone called Priya. Priya is a 60-year-old grandmother, right? A homeowner living in India, responsible for three grandchildren, and are near the Ganges, which is a floodplain, and that has been flooded twice in the last 5 years with a disease outbreak, right? So she has a lot on her plate already throughout her life, and during her day to day, and also she's had some experience previously, right, with natural disasters, specifically flooding. And furthermore, we decided to build a storyboard on how the user would interact with a application like this. So we broke it up into three phases: pre-flood, during flood, and post-flood. So pre-flood, right, is where the user first comes in contact with the app. We see that there's usually two ways this happens in a community like this. One is through probably some sort of a poster or a advertising campaign from the government. So Priya might see one of these posters on the streets. And another way, actually, in these that happens very common in these communities is that the kids are the people who kind of disseminate this information, because kids are in school a lot, and a lot of these kind of disaster preparedness campaigns are done in schools. So the kids, right, might become educated first and learn about this app, and come back and tell Priya to download this app. So Priya then is aware of the app. She downloads the app, and at this point, the main focus of the app is basically a set of instructions and checklists on how she can best prepare. Right. So an example would be something like, hey, move maybe potential hazardous chemicals to upper levels of the shelf, so that when flooding occurs, the chemical doesn't get swept away by the water. So Priya follows this checklist, right? Make sure that her home is in the best shape possible in the event of a flood. And the other piece we wanted in there was to build a chatbot that answers any other questions that Priya has. Chatbots has a lot of distinct advantages. For us, we thought the main advantage was that Priya, probably isn't the most technology savvy person, and we don't want her to navigate some really complex UI. We wanted to build a chatbot that closely mimics her daily experience of using just text messaging, because if there is, one app that Priya would be very familiar with, you will be text messaging. So we wanted to be interface that's already very familiar with her, so she can adopt the technology easier. So she will also have a chatbot available that interacts with Priya, um, and Val later on will talk about how the starter kit helps you build a chatbot like this. And finally, we also threw in something that could be kind of a cherry on top. It would be if there could be an integration with the insurance company, so that Priya can take pictures of her new setup, more prepared setup, and show that to insurance companies, specifically homeowners insurance, so that her insurance premium can be reduced. And this can be a program, right, that can be established with the government, with the insurance company, to incentivize users to better prepare for um, to have better flood preparedness. The second phase will be actually during a flood, when the flood actually occurs. So during a disaster, it's really important to keep the information simple and actionable, right? This is one of the things that experts really told us, because when a flood actually happens, everyone has tunnel vision, and you just simply need to keep it simple on telling user what to do. So in our case, if the government triggers the warning system and now we're officially in a flood, the app updates, and now Priya is notified that a flood is occurring. When she opens the app, it's basically a simple interface that guides Priya to the nearest evacuation point. Of course, the government updates will also be available via the app, so Priya can stay on top of the situation. And then one nice to have feature here will be probably for her and her grandkids to share their status to make sure that to tell each other that they're safe. And finally, post-flood. So post-flood, we thought that there could be something that facilitates the community to recover faster from the natural disaster and really mitigate the damage. So post-flood, we decided that there should be a marketplace that allows community to share resources with each other. So let's say Priya found a place with drinkable water sources or food distribution. She can add that to the app. It can also be a marketplace where people can simply share tools. So someone can say, hey, I'm looking for an axe or a chainsaw to remove a roadblock, and someone else can say, hey, I happen to have one, right? And people can post the available resources they have to help the community come together and recover from the flood much quicker. So that's kind of the aspirational goal of this app. And hopefully that gives you, some ideas of where we're at and where are places that you can make an impact. Obviously, the starter kit focuses on something more specific, and Val will talk about that, right? So we picked the one piece that we thought was helpful in getting your implementation started. So Val will quickly talk about that. So now let me take you to the website where the actual starter kit is. And you can see the URL on top, and you can find it in many places. And we'll share the resource, the page with you. And so this is the disaster resiliency starter kit. As you scroll down, you'll see that on the right we have the Here Technologies logo, and that is because Here Technologies is a very instrumental piece. Here Technology is one of our integration partners, and the actual underlying technology is very helpful for someone who's building this because they offer location services and location API. And so at this point, I would like to bring in Raymond from Here Technologies and have him take over and talk about Here Technologies and how Here Technologies can help in this situation. Raymond?
Cool. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Raymond Camden. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And it's going to stop your screen sharing. And we know that. All right. And I'm just checking the Twitch stream as well. By the way, I'll be sharing a couple of links, but I'll wait until I'm done screen sharing. I'll put that in the Twitch stream. And I'm just glancing over at my laptop to see if it shows up. Cool. There we go. So again, good morning, afternoon, etc. I'm Raymond Camden. I'm a developer advocate for Here Technologies. We have essentially pretty much every location-based API service, mapping service, etc. that you could think of. Everything I'm talking about today, you can play with right now. I am on our developer portal at developer.here.com, and there's a sign up right there that you could click and register. You don't need a credit card of any kind at all. We have a really good free tier. So I know as a developer myself, I like any technology where I could play around with it and not worry about getting a bill 30 days down the line or so. So again, every single thing I'll be talking about today, you can definitely play with and see if you like it. If you have any questions about what I'm talking about today, definitely reach out to me. Again, when I'm done screen sharing, I will on the Twitch stream share a couple links. I'll share my Twitter username, and my DMs are open. So I like to get questions. It helps me learn more and it helps me create content. So definitely reach out to me if you have any questions about what I'm talking about today. So in the starter kit, there's a couple of examples of a few of our services. And what I have done is written up a blog post and kind of talked about those services and made a couple of demos. I'm going to show you those demos today. And again, I'll share the link to the blog post if you want to read it at a slower pace later on and see more about what I'm talking about. But the first aspect that I want to talk about is our routing. And if you look at our documentation for routing, it gets pretty complex in terms of all the different types of things that we support. So not only just going from A to B, but I want to go A to B to C to D, and I'm leaving at this time, and I care about traffic, and I'm worried about charging my electric vehicle. Pretty much any type of routing scenario that you can think of, the API supports, including things like isoline routing, which is something I only learned about half a year or so ago. Basically, where I'm at a particular I'm at a particular location and I need to know how far I could travel within a certain time frame. And certainly, in terms of a disaster, you may be timed in terms of how quickly you can get away from something. That type of scenario is something that our APIs could support. One of the things that I built was a simple example of using our routing API with our mapping library. We have a JavaScript based mapping library that integrates with our routing service. If you want to render a map with a route, that's pretty simple. Also know that all the routing stuff is a REST-based API as well. So if you don't want to render a map, if you want to use a voice assistant or some other means to display a route, that's also going to be an option as well. So what I'm going to do is quickly show you an example, and I'm just trying to move that darn share screen out of the way a little bit. So this is a simple of example showing a route going from Lafayette, Louisiana to New Orleans. It's static. I didn't type anything in to say I'm going from A to B. I just kind of assumed a couple of hard-coded values. But I want to show you the code behind this particular example because it's really pretty simple. All right, I'm going to scroll up a little bit here, make my font even bigger. Make that a little bit easier to read. All right, so our mapping library, like most mapping libraries, will ask you to load a couple of JavaScript libraries and as well as a CSS file. And again, this is all documented, so don't worry about knowing what every single line does. I start off by creating the map. And that's as simple as using a key. By the way, this particular key, our platform supports creating keys that are restricted to a host URL. So it's totally safe to have this in my code because it can't be used outside of the domains that I specify. But essentially, I've created a map and I have centered it on Lafayette, Louisiana. Once I've done that, this is all you would need then to create a map, have it on there, support drag and drop, zooming, basic controls, etc. The routing support is not that complex. I begin by asking for an instance of the routing service. I then start specifying my parameters, and again, I'm doing the simplest possible way of doing this. Essentially, fastest route in a car from one point, starting point, to an end point. Again, if I wanted to have more complex routing, some stops along the way, or perhaps if I was a truck with hazardous materials, I could specify all that as well. I take that, I pass it to my router object and ask it to calculate a route. The service is going to return basically all the geometry type values I need to render that on map. And that's all you're seeing in this code right here. And again, all of this is shared. I'm going to hop on Twitch the second I'm done screen sharing. I'll share this link and you can copy and paste it and work with it yourself as long as you change the key. But essentially get the routing parameters, draw it on screen. I pick the blue color. All of this you can customize all you want. And the very last thing I did basically was say, take that map and then re-show it to have the entire route on screen. And again, that is what you're seeing right here. The second thing that I want to talk about is, basically how to use maps with markers. And again, we do have documentation for that. And again, I will share all the links. You kind of saw an example of that with the routing, where I put a marker and at my starting position and at my end position. A more semi-realistic example may be I have some backend service that returns geographic information and I need to show it. Again, in terms of the disaster kit, those resources may be food, may be medical places to go to get help, etc. I need a way to show that on a map. So I have a simple example of that. And in this case, my map data is hard coded, but you can imagine, again, calling a backend API to get it. This is the code, and it's virtually the exact same as what I had for my previous routing examples. Essentially, load a map, center it on Lafayette, Louisiana. That's because that's where I live. And then in terms of adding markers, it's incredibly simple. I take my data, which again, in this case, is going to be hard coded. And then for each of those locations, I run a add object and pass it a marker. Going back to how that renders, that kind of blue light bulb type marker, you can absolutely change that to something else. So I mentioned how my data may be food, it may be medical supplies. You can absolutely have a different marker for each of those types of examples. The last thing I want to talk about, the last service you may consider is our weather service. I know IBM has a very good weather service as well. You can use that, you could use ours, you can use anyone's really, but we do have a weather service that will return things like forecast, return things like even when the moon is going to rise, moon phase, as well as alerts. And you could definitely imagine, post a disaster of some sort, if there's going to be further storms or things like that, that's absolutely information that you would want to bring up to people. So we have documentation about this API. You can read it. It gets pretty detailed. All I want to show you is the amount of information returned. And give me 1 second. There's my Firefox. So all I did was paste in that particular API call in my Firefox browser. By the way, Firefox is really good at rendering JSON nicely. The actual result from our API is just a raw JSON string. Firefox does a great job of making it a little bit readable. So again, this is my hometown, Lafayette, Louisiana. It's definitely warm. I loaded this about an hour ago, and if I just reload it, we should see it's already almost 3 degrees warmer, not surprised at all. And I also see things like, what type of weather, in this case, scattered clouds, as well as if it's raining or not. But again, so this is our weather service. IBM has a really good one as well. You're definitely welcome to mix and match these APIs and see which ones work best for you. So again, that's all I have to show. All these examples are things that you could use with the starter kit. As soon as Va takes over and I stop screen sharing, I'm going to hop on that Twitch stream real quick and share these URLs. And again, definitely feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about what I showed today or anything else related to here and location. So thank you. Va.
So, yep. Hello? Yeah. Thank you, Raymond. That was a lot of good stuff. And at this point, what I want to do is get into the tutorial and the starter kit more specifically. So back on the starter kit page, let's see, I believe. Okay, so if we scroll through it, we can see the actual architecture diagram for what Josh had described earlier. And what we have here is basically, let's see, it combines both real-time machine learning and some, combines some real machine learning along with some real-time data to deliver some flood safety information. Now we have a backend component, which is Node.js running on IBM Cloud. And then we have a front-end component, which is a mobile app using React Native. And the way it's going to work is basically the user is going to launch the app, and then they'll have access to the information that these services provide. So for example, we have the Watson Assistant, And that's going to be the chat application that Josh talked about earlier. And in there, pre-UI user can go ahead and ask questions and get answers having to do with flood planning and recovery and so on. And then there's a machine learning component of it, and that could take in data from a bunch of services out there and then make recommendations or preparations and assessments and best practices. And then we have the weather company API information, and that will be providing the real-time weather updates and the alert. Or you can, like Raymond said, you can substitute this with the Here Weather APIs as well. And then finally, we have the Here Location services. And that's going to provide the geolocation info for the safety points and routes for evacuation and so on. So that basic architecture diagram is for the complete solution that Josh talked about. But what I'm going to go into is the tutorial, which the tutorial just takes a subset of this and gets it implemented for you to help you get started. So also from here, you have the link to the tutorial. So I can just go into there. All right, so here's the tutorial. And as you go through the tutorial, it'll have the step-by-step instructions for what to do, what needs to be done. But first of all, there's a set of prerequisites which you're going to have to complete or to have in place before you can go ahead and run the tutorial. So the first thing is the IBM Cloud. So you can register for IBM Cloud. There's a free account, and all the services we're going to be using on IBM Cloud for this tutorial are free. They have a free tier, so you don't need to have a credit card or make any payments. So once you register for IBM Cloud, you'd want to go ahead and install the IBM Cloud CLI. And what that is just going to give you a command line interface for you to be able to deploy and upload the server to the IBM Cloud. And then also you'd want to register with Here, so we can go ahead and get a registration key, so we can go ahead and incorporate some of the Here services that Raymond talked about into our application. And then there's also the React Native CLI dependencies. So like I mentioned, the mobile app is React Native, so you need the dependencies for this. So if you go to the React Native page, you can basically just go to setting up the dev environment, and then the React Native CLI quick start. And from here, depending on your development environment and what you're trying to target, you would select the appropriate tabs. So in my case, I'm going to be demoing the Mac OS. I'm going to be demoing iOS, and for that, we require actually the Mac OS environment. And now while I'm demoing the iOS version here, the starter kit also works on Android. There are instructions for setting it up on Android as well, and you can follow those. But the first thing you'd want to do is be set up with the Node.js environment, and also install Watchman. And Watchman is going to go watch your files. So while you're developing and making changes to your file, it'll update in the background. And for iOS, you're going to need to have Xcode installed. And Xcode is the runtime or IDE for the Mac OS. And then you're also going to need CocoaPods. And what CocoaPods is going to do is going to be the dependency manager for your Objective-C runtimes. So once you have those in place, and actually real quick before that, I can show you the Android. And for Android, what's going to be different is you're going to need the Java development kit, and also you're going to need Android Studio configured in there. So go, which tab is it? All right, so once we have the prerequisites in place, then you're ready to go ahead and launch the application or set. But so the first thing you want to do is set up Watson Assistant. So to set up Watson Assistant, you'd go to the IBM Cloud Catalog. Let me move the share out of the way here. All right. So let's find which tab it's in. All right, so here you go. So in the IBM Cloud Catalog, you can go ahead and provision an instance of Watson Assistant. So you would go ahead, select the region you're in, or the area, the region that's closest to where you are at. And then, like I mentioned, we're going to be using the free tier in this case. The free tier provides 10,000 messages a month, which is more than plenty for running the tutorial and testing it out or building your solution. And then you would go ahead and give your service a name, and then you just click on create, and that would go ahead and create your assistance. And I already have one created, so we can take a look at that. So let's do this. So once you're in IBM Cloud, you can see in the dashboard, the list of services you have. So I'm going to go up to my services. And in here, here's the Watson Assistant service I created earlier. So I'm going to go into that. So once I open that up, I'll go ahead and launch it. And once you're here, you would create a new assistant. So you just basically go ahead and click on the create button, and then you would give your assistant name. And one thing you'd probably want to do is leave this enable preview link on, and that allows you to test and preview what the chatbot would look like. But if you don't want to do that, you're free to uncheck it as well. But I find it useful when developing and trying to test out the assistant before I deploy it. So, hold on, I'm going to move this window out of the way. All right, so I have the starter kit assistant already created. So what you would typically do is the next step would be to come in and create a skill for the assistant. So you would click on, actually, let me show you that first in case anybody missed it. So on the left-hand side here, the first one is to see the assistants you have. And then the second button is to see the skills. And this is where you would go to go ahead and create your skill. So you click create skill. Oops, not that I meant to hit that one. So you select the dialogue skill. Since our assistant is just going to be conversing, so we're just going to need a dialogue, but you can create a search skill if you're searching documents and doing other things. So then we would click next. And then you typically you would go ahead and, if you're going to start a new project, and create an empty skill where then you can go in and add information to the skill, or you can use a sample skill if you wanted to play around. But in this particular tutorial, we already have a skill created for you that you can just import to help you get started. So you would just choose here and then browse to the skill to have it added. So I have the skill right here already imported. All right, and from once you import it, this is what you're going to see. And with skills, there are a couple of things to know. There are intents, entities, and dialogues. So the intent is the way to group as sort of the intentions or what the user is asking or talking about. So for example, if we look at my flood about intent, and what this does is gonna, if the user asks any questions or makes any statements similar to what I have here, they're gonna be grouped and categorized as the flood about intent. And in here, I can go ahead and add additional intents, or go ahead and remove or edit these as I need it. But typically, you in a new setup, you'd go ahead and add all the intents you need. Here, we've added some common ones around flood education. So you can take these, add to them, improve upon them. And the other thing would be entities. Now, entities are it's sort of like keywords or terminologies that you want to be able to identify in the responses in the questions being asked. And for our dialogue, it's a very simple, basic dialogue you'll see in a minute. It's just, you just ask a couple questions, you get an answer. So it's not too complex, so I don't have any entities, but you could go ahead and create an entity here if you needed. But you can see we have some system entities already available. So for example, the date entity, this will recognize dates in multiple different formats. So if somebody just typed in Friday or today or November 1 now, it'll recognize that as being a date. So you can go ahead and do something with that information. Or for example, time, it'll recognize time at different formats or different ways people write the time. And then once you have your intents or entities in place, you would go into your dialogue. And we already have some dialogue set up for you already. But what the dialogue does is it directs the flow of the conversation. And as you can see here, for this particular tutorial, it's a very straightforward. We just have the different intents, and each intent, what happens is we're telling the Watson Assistant, when it recognizes the question is for this intent, respond with this message. And we can go ahead and do that for all our additional intents. But if we wanted to create something more complex, or start nesting and other stuff like that, we can go ahead and add a child node to this, where you can create more verbose, more detailed conversation flows. And so once you have that in place, you can go ahead and while you're developing, you can try out your dialogue to make sure everything is working as you intend. So for example, I can ask a question, what is a flood? And then it'll tell me that it categorized this as a flood about entity, and it gives you the response. And this is fine, this is what I expect. But if perhaps this wasn't what I wanted, I can go ahead here and recategorize it as something else. So this allows me to, while developing, test it out and make sure. And as you can see, if you change it, it goes ahead and starts the training over again. So this is a good way to test and set up your entity and your conversation dialogue the way that you'd expect it to go. And once you're happy with all that, the other thing you can do with Watson Assistant is if you go into your assistant, there's the preview link that I mentioned. So if you have the preview link enabled, you can just go ahead and click on preview. It'll give you the link. And then from this link, you'll actually get a web interface to the chatbot where you can actually run and test the chatbot and see what it would behave like if you were running it in a web application. So you can get an idea of what it's about. So go ahead and this is another way of testing it and just to see how the flow of the conversation would go. Since our conversation is very basic, it's just ask a question, get an answer. There's not much to test here, but you can imagine if you were having a more complex dialogue flow with nesting and all that, you'd want to rigorously test it here before you go ahead and put it into production. So now that we're happy with our assistant, we're going to need the assistant detail information. So if I go into the assistant and I go here and I can go into the settings, and here's where I can find the detail information. So I click on the API details and that would go ahead and give me the API detail information, and don't worry about it. This assistant is not going to function so you can see the API information. But what you're going to need is you're going to need the assistant ID. You're going to need the assistant URL. Now for the assistant URL, you only need the host name portion. You don't need the rest of it. And then also you're going to need your API key. And so that's what information you'll be using on your assistant. So once you have that information, we can get back to the next step of the tutorial. So the next step would be to generate an API key from the here. So what you can do is you can go to, you sign into here development. And let's see, let me sign in. Oops. Sorry about that. I have to move this mute button somewhere where I can't keep hitting it. There you go. How about there? All right. So let's go ahead and log in. So once you're logged in, you can go ahead and, in this case, I have my project set up, my test project that I've been through. And in here, you can go ahead and see is where you go. You click to create the API key, and then you can get the API key. And this is what you're going to be using later on in your application. So you have to make sure. So the next part would actually be to go ahead and run the server with all this information we have set up. So let me go ahead and change over to VS Code here, where I've cloned the repo and I have it running here locally. So, and in the README, you have the same information you'll find in the tutorial. So if you want, you can actually follow along in the README. And like I mentioned, the README is actually a little bit more detailed in the tutorial because it separates the information for iOS and Android. So if you're following Android, you follow the sections that are talking about Android specifically. So let's just jump over to the run server section. So the first thing you'd want to do is you have this env file, and you would go here and you would add your assistant ID and your assistant API key and the assistant URL from the API detail information. And as I mentioned, you only want to include the host name. You don't need to include the rest of the information for the URL. And once you have that in place, we can go ahead and go. Let me actually make this a little bit bigger so people can see. Okay, so hopefully that's big enough. So we'll go ahead and we're going to go into the, so if we look real quick, there's a server app and then a mobile app. So I'm going to go ahead and CD into the server portion of it. Oops. And in here, I'll just go ahead and run the npm install to install the node, the appendices. And once the dependencies are in place, I can go ahead and now deploy it locally or deploy it on the cloud. So to deploy it on the cloud, I'll just go ahead and log into IBM Cloud and then target the Cloud Foundry service. And then I would go ahead and just run IBM Cloud push to push it to the IBM Cloud. So I can go ahead and I'm go ahead and push it. Now that's going to take a second to do. So while that's going through, I'll go ahead and just deploy it locally as well. So to deploy it, all you do is just run npm start deploy locally. All right, so I have npm start. So it's running locally, so I can go ahead and go to the local host and I get a status okay. So now the server doesn't have any UI or it doesn't serve up any HTML or anything like that. All that is in the mobile app. So we just have a basic endpoint here that just tells you if it's okay, if it's able to connect to Watson, all right. If it wasn't able to connect to the assistant, you'd go ahead and get an error there. And then we can also actually test it by calling one of the API endpoints. And that go ahead and returns an API session key that I need for the conversation. So that's working fine. So then the server is working. So what I'm going to do, we can look at the server code real quick. And the server is basically simple. There's two main files. There's the assistant.json. And the assistant.json, this is just going to be communicating with the Watson assistant. And we basically use the Watson assistant SDK to communicate with the assistant. And you pull in the assistant ID, API key, as well, and the URL from the environment file that you have set up. And then it basically has two functions. We have the message and the session. So the session is before you communicate with Watson Assistant, you're going to need to provide it a session ID. And the session ID is what it's going to use to keep context of the conversation. So if there's multiple conversations happening, or if you start asking multiple questions and you have a complicated dialogue flow, it can pull in the context from the previous stuff you were asking during the conversation. So it needs that session ID. So before you make any calls or start doing the communication, you ask for a session ID. Now with the free tier, the session ID, I believe, lasts for 5 minutes of inactivity. So if there's no inactivity after 5 minutes, it goes ahead and invalidates that session ID, and then you have to ask for a new one. As long as there's conversation going on, you should be okay. But with the pay tier, you can set that inactive time for any variable amount you want. So the session will go ahead and just use the call the create session from the assistant, providing the assistant ID, and then you get the session ID like I got here. And the other part of this is the message. And the message is actually going to have the conversation with the assistant. So we basically take the assistant ID, the session ID, as well as the message that the user typed into the chat, put it into a payload, and just send it to the assistant. And then we're going to get the response and return it. So that's basically it. There's not much to it more than that. And we just take the session, the assistant, and we go ahead and pass the message, and then you get the response back. So that's basically it for the server. And we actually can see here that my deployment completed. So what I can actually do is make sure that's up and running. I can take that URL and try it out as well. So I should get an okay. So yeah, okay. And if I try to get an API, excuse me, a session ID, that should work as well. So my deployment on IBM Cloud is good to go. So I can go ahead and set up my client, the mobile client, to go ahead and access that. So then now we can look at let's take a look at the mobile client. So let's go back here. So for the mobile client, we just want to go into the mobile directory. So we have server directory. Now we're going to go into the mobile directory. So in the mobile directory, we also have an environment file for you to configure your mobile environment as well. And here's where you put in the server URL. So I can connect to the local server, or I can go ahead and connect to the server that I deployed. And then here's also where you would put in your here API key. So I'd copy that API key from the here page and just paste it in here so the client can use it for the conversation. So now if we continue, so for the client, to get the client up and running, you basically do a lot of the same stuff, which is installing the dependencies. So I can run npm install to go ahead and run the node dependencies. I'll go ahead and pull in the React Native stuff that needs and any libraries that we're using. So that shouldn't take too long. All right, that's all set. And then since I'm going to run the iOS version, I'm going to go ahead and cd to the iOS directory and install the CocoaPods dependencies. And that'll install the dependencies that's needed by Objective-C. And that shouldn't take too long either. Okay, so all the dependencies are in place. So now I can go ahead and run my app. So basically, I would just do npm run iOS, and that'll go ahead and launch the iOS simulator and then install the app on the simulator and launch the app from there. Or if I was doing Android, I would similarly, I would just do npm run Android. So there we go, the simulator is launched. Now it's going to go ahead and install the app on the simulator. And then once the app is installed on the simulator, it's going to go ahead and pull it up. So the running in the simulator usually takes a little bit of time. So it's hopefully it doesn't take too long here. And I guess while we're waiting for that, one thing I want to mention is what you want to be careful is when you set up the simulator, whether it's the iOS simulator or the Android emulator, you have to, since we're going to be using location information, you have to set up the location services for the simulator. So on the iOS, you'd go into features, location, and you can set up a custom, because by default, I believe it's none. So then none of the location would work on your app. So you can set up to a custom location like I have it here, or you can go ahead and select one of the predefined location that Apple already makes available. So here we go. I have my app up and running. And actually, before I show you the app, there's one other thing we want to do is you want to go into the settings and make sure location services is turned on. So private. So location services is turned on. And I want to make sure it's okay. It's going to ask me next time I run the starter kit, the application. So let's go back into it. So the application is basic at this point. It has the home page, the chat page, and the map. And it just gives you some information and shows you how you can go ahead and get started building your own app. And on the homepage, we just have two buttons that take you. This one takes you to call for code, and the other one will take you to the GitHub repo. But then the chat, now the chat here is actually what's going to integrate with Watson Assistant. So here I can ask questions. And it's going to go out to Watson Assistant, get the response, and bring it back here. So and this is communicating. So the client is going through getting the session and then going ahead and sending the information. So we can communicate with the assistant here. Now the other component is the map component. And the map, so yes, allow while using the app. And the map component is, this is where we're pulling in the here stuff. And what it's doing, it's going to take the location information that I've put in, center the map around that. And then from there, I can go ahead and search for information. So for example, if I wanted to search for nearby hospitals, if I needed to. And it's going to go ahead and do that search. It's going to use the here places, the search for that information, return all that information. Then I take all that information, I plot it on the map and add all the markers like Raymond showed earlier. And for each one of these, I can click on it, see what area that is. So I can see this is the UNC Rex Healthcare Center. And also what it's going to do is it provides the routing information to that location. So I can go ahead and click there and see the routing information that it included. So I can get the details for routing to that information. So now all this is run using the here location services. So the routing, the searching, the mapping, it's all with here. Or I can also, there's a couple quick buttons here. So if I wanted to quickly find emergency services, I can go ahead and click on that. And that's just going to do a quick search for emergency services and reload the map with that information. So I can see here, this is the Raleigh Police Department. Right. So that's the app itself in a nutshell. So what we want to do is go ahead and look at some of the code behind here. So if you want to go ahead and play around with this or try to extend this or add additional information, I'm going to walk through a little bit of that code and show you what we have there. So let me go back to my IDE here. So again, so we have the mobile app, and under the mobile app, we have the app.js. So the app.js is basically going to be the entry point, and this is all React Native code. And we're loading in a bunch of screens, a home screen, chat screen, and the map screen. And the app.js is just basically just defines the layout for us. So we have our tab layouts with our 3 tabs in the bottom. And then we have the layout for the chat and the layout for the map. And then we just put all those together in a layout, in a navigation container. So that's basically for the app. So this is where you would go if you wanted to add additional tabs or change the layout of the page, you'd go into here. And now if we take a look at these screens a little bit more closely, we can go into the source. And in the source, we have our screens here. So the first one we can look at the home screen. And now the home screen, we have our styling up here, a CSS. It is just the basic layout. We have the image that you saw at the top. Then we just have some text content. And then we have the 2 buttons, the one that take you to call for code, and the one that takes you to the solution starter kit. And that's basically for the home page, nothing too complex there. And then we'll look at the chat. Now the chat interface, and likewise, it's very similar. We have, move this out so you can see a little bit more of it. So we have our styling up here. And then, so what we do is we're gonna go ahead and grab the server URL from our config, and we're gonna be using that so we can communicate with the Watson assistant. And the chat does 2 main things. It gets the session, so it makes the API call to get the session. And once it gets that session, it goes ahead and sets that session, so that way we can keep using it. And then we have the fetch message, which is actually going to make the API call to get the message. And then we have the function here, which handles the response that we get back from the server, which if it's a good response, we'll just go ahead and add the message to the chat screen. So when we send a message, we're just going to try to fetch a message. And like I mentioned, if an activity has been on for more than 5 minutes with the free play pan, then you need to reestablish and re-get the session. So that's why here I go ahead, fetch the session. And then if we get an error, then try to get the session again, because it's most likely that we timed out, and then run the fetch again with a new session that we received. And then once we get the information, we can go ahead and handle the response. And here we have the layout. It's just a scroll view. And then as we have our text input that the user can enter their message, a button that they can go ahead and send a message. And then we just have our scroll view that just goes ahead and just lays out all the messages as they start coming in. And the next thing we probably should look at is the map. Now the map is a little bit different because for here I actually used a map view. So what the map view I used the web view. What the web view is it actually is a view that shows a web page. So I actually created the map just using regular HTML JavaScript, and then just display it here using the web view. And in the web view, I just give it the URL to that page that I have set up. And then, what else? Anything in here that's worth calling out? Yep, so here I'm using the geolocation to get that current position. So it's going to ask the device for your location. So then I can go ahead and send that message on to the here mapping service, so it can go ahead and plot it. So like I mentioned, the web view is just going to be loading a web page. So if we look at the web page here, we can see it's just a basic HTML page. It has a lot of the stuff that well, actually, we have here where we're going to put the container. We have that search container that you saw, the sidebar panel that go ahead and opens up that you saw, and we just have the toggle it, and then we init the map and stuff. So the good stuff is actually in the here.js. And this is where we have all that information that Raymond was showing earlier. So here we go ahead and we init them, our map, and we get our layers to display it. And we also have to update the location as we get new locations. And we're also adding markers to the map. And over here is where we actually do our searches. So, and then once we get the results from the search, we're just going to put them in a group and add the markers onto the map. And then we center the map around all those points that we get back. And then here is where we'd go ahead and use the routing service to pull in the routes that you want. So when the user clicks on a marker, it calculates the route between where they're located and the marker they clicked in. So all that's happening here in this JavaScript using the here location services. We're using the mapping service, the routing service, and the search service, and all that which Raymond went over. And I believe, yes, and the rest of the stuff here, we have the fonts, we're just using the Plex font. And then we have the images we're using in the map. So that's the image that we're using for the icon logo. But the rest of the stuff here is basically stuff that comes with React Native, and you wouldn't probably need to tweak most of it. Like for example, stuff in the iOS folder, that's just all the code to go ahead and prepare it for an iOS target. And then you have the Android, which go ahead and all the code for running it on Android. So most of the stuff in there, you're not gonna be touching other than the screens that I just went over in the code. So that's mostly it for the, let's see if there's anything else missing. No, no, I think that's basically what I wanted to cover for the app. So hopefully you have a, oops, let's see, let me go back to the website. You have a better understanding of the starter kit, and you have some ideas on how you can take this to the next level, how you can repurpose this for a use case you have in mind, or how you can add additional functionalities such as alerts or notifications. Maybe add that integration to the weather APIs or to other public services. And then you can adapt it also. So while we geared it towards flood education, you can go ahead and adapt it toward other disasters like earthquakes and hurricanes. Or possibly you can extend the chat to make it more robust and more detailed conversation. And then I'm sure there are here services that Raymond showed and other ones that you can go ahead and pull into this kind of solution. And so all the tools we've provided are all here. And now it's up to you to just go ahead and take these resources from IBM in here and see what you can build to help you, help your community face climate change. And all you have to do is basically go to the Call for Code page to get started. And getting started is pretty straightforward. You basically accept the challenge and register for Call for Code. Then you learn about it and take advantage of the starter kit, the technologies and the resources that we showed here and the other ones that are on the page. And you can also join the Slack workspace, and that allows you to ask questions, to find teammates, and to interact with Call for Code mentors and participants as well. And then the last step would be for you to build your solution and then submit it. And when you submit it, you have, of course, the chance to win $200,000 and the opportunity to get your solution deployed. So, so you want to keep in mind, let's go to the timeline, I believe, down here somewhere. All right, so you want to keep in mind that the challenge is running through July 31st, so you have to have your submission in by July 31st, and then the winner will be announced sometime in October. So along with the climate track we went over today, there's also the COVID-19 track, and there are resources for that as well. And that track is for applications that help communities address the challenges that are brought about by the COVID-19 crisis. And with that, I think we can wrap up our broadcast. So feel free to reach out to any of us. You can go ahead and play around with this and the other starter kits. And all this stuff is available on developer.ibm.com/call4code. And all the here technology stuff is available on developer.here.com. And I want to thank Josh, who was with us earlier today. And again, thank Raymond and all the here team. So I don't know if you have any additional last comments you wanted to make, Raymond, before we wrap it up here. No, okay, you're good. Yeah. All right, so finally, I guess I just want to thank everyone from the IBM and the here community for watching us on this live stream, and thank you.